So much for why you would want to do game development using Scrum. Now to the more detailed explanation. How does Scrum work and how does Scrum apply specifically to game development? So, quick overview of the Scrum process is when you look at the process, when you look here at the diagram, you can basically see you start out with a product backlog. That is the list of features that initially, when you look at your game, you say, this is everything that we will have to build or that we hope building in the end, somewhere down the line. Then, every sprint, every time box, every 2 weeks or every 1 week, depending on how you do it, you look at the product backlog, you say, okay, what's the next thing that we're going to build in the next time iteration? You set out a goal for that. You split that task up into tasks. That's your sprint backlog. And then over the course of 2 to 4 weeks or 1 to 4 weeks, you build a new potentially shippable product increment, something you can show off, something you can demo. And within those 1 to 4 weeks, every day you have a daily Scrum meeting. One meeting where everybody in the team sits together and talks about what they're going to do. That's the process in a nutshell. So let's talk about the elements in specific. As I noticed, game development in Scrum is organized in sprints, duration of 1 to 4 weeks. The fact that you have a constant duration, always the same duration in which you work, leads to a better rhythm. Everybody knows what to do when and when to expect what. And in that sprint, a piece of the product or an iteration of the product of the game is designed. You come up with the idea, flesh out the idea, it's coded, it's developed, and tested during the same sprint. That's the main thing that differentiates agile processes, Scrum in specific, from the waterfall process, right? In the waterfall process, first you analyze all the requirements, then you do all the designing, then you do all the coding and all the testing, and then everything falls apart. In Scrum, you overlay all of that in one little sprint time box of 1 to 4 weeks. Second important thing about sprint is there are no changes introduced during sprint. At the beginning of a sprint, you set out what to do. You do that, you ship the new part, and only then at the end of it do you look at it and say, does it work? Does it not work? Should we change anything about that? Okay, so that's the quick overview. Let's talk about all the different components of the Scrum process. Basically, you can cluster these into 3 different groups of components. One is the different roles you have. The other is the ceremonies, the kind of processes or steps you go through, and then the artifacts, the kind of things you work with, the objects you work with in those ceremonies, in those roles. So let's look into each in turn. Roles, Scrum typically recognizes 3 roles: the product owner, the Scrum Master, and the team. The product owner, and again, this doesn't have to be one person, right? This can be you as the team, but there is the role of the product owner who defines the features of the game, decides on a release date and content of that release date, prioritizes features according to market value, which in your case is according to how fun the game is or what the product owner thinks most helps the game to become more fun. And the product owner can adjust features and priority at every iteration as needed. Right? That's the great thing about Scrum. You're very flexible. After an iteration, you can say, we have to totally redo this, or we previously thought we have to work on a joystick controller, but now we realize joystick isn't really what we need. We need something completely else. So you can change from iteration to iteration, and the product owner can accept or reject the results of work. Can look at it and say, yeah, that's good to go. Let's move on to the next one, or not. The Scrum Master is sort of the opposite of a classic manager, right? A classic manager commands and controls a team. The Scrum Master is basically the servant of the team who helps the team succeed. And how does the Scrum Master do that? By representing management to the project and representing the project, the team, to the management. So that's basically the go-to person, so that not individual people of the team get drawn out of their work tasks, and that there is one continuous stream of communication between management or the client and the team. Make sure that the process and the practices are maintained. And then the main job there is basically that you run around as a Scrum Master helping your team become productive by asking your team, is there anything in your way? Do you have any issues getting the job done that you set out to do in this iteration? How can I help you with that? So that's basically the Scrum Master. Then there's the team. team, cross-functional, programmers, testers, user experience designers, etc. Team members are not fixed to their roles, right? Even though in your team contract you articulated roles, and even though somebody might primarily do something, in teams it is perfectly normal within the Scrum framework that somebody says, yeah, art is not my best thing to do right now, but I know in this iteration we all only work on the art aspect, so whatever I can help out there, help out there. Typical size is 5 to 9 people, so you're right in there. And members of the team should be full-time, right? People should be committed to the project full-time and not part-time. And I'm aware that's the first thing that you will have to struggle with, this being just a class. Teams are self-organizing. That means how the team itself does its work is organized and decided by the team. There is no management forcing any role or anything to do on the team. But that doesn't mean that the team itself doesn't make collective decisions what to do or gives itself team titles and roles as you did. And membership in the team should only happen between sprints, not in the sprints. But again, because this is a class, you're a standing team in a class, that shouldn't be an issue. So, that being said, those are the main roles. Let's talk about the different ceremonies, the different things you do repeatedly within a Scrum framework. There are 4 of these ceremonies that are standard to Scrum, and then there's one at the top, you see in brackets, the project setup. That's basically the one that's not a standard one because you just do it once. So what is a project setup? That's true for every project basically. At the beginning of your project, you set up the project. You do that by first articulating and committing to a product vision. You say, overall, this is what we're going to do. Knowing that as part of the Scrum process that can change, but you have an idea of what you want to do, right? That's ideally going to be your pitch document or something like that. You assess, you determine who is on your team. You determine the velocity of your team, that is the speed at which you think your team can work, and your releases and release dates, that is at what points in time will your team release at the end of a sprint a piece of product, a piece of game. And assessing the velocity basically means how many man hours can each individual team member actually contribute per sprint, and then you calculate that together. That's your velocity. As part of the project sped up without that, or apart from that, you also break the product vision into concrete user stories. What these user stories are, I'm going to talk about. You rank them by user value. You say which one are the most important one, which are the one most contributing to making the game more fun. You estimate the user stories by ideal hours. So how many hours does it take so that we get the joystick controller to work? How many hours does it make until we get the character to move? Stuff like that. And then if you look at the total timeline you have, you break the user stories that are ranked by value into these rough releases based on how much time you think they will take them. And automatically at that point you will notice that all the nifty features you thought of, you will very likely not get to do within the time frame of the project. That's why you rank order them by priority, by value. And notably, this process takes time. This first setup, you should have 2-3 continuous uninterrupted hours to just go through this, to do this thoroughly. So just be warned, this is a process that takes a bit of time, but it's important. So the next process is a regular process of Scrum. It's a sprint planning meeting, right? At the beginning of each sprint, you plan what you're going to do in that sprint. And that is based on what's your team's capacity. So maybe somebody's sick, or maybe somebody joined the team. What's the product backlog? What is the stuff? What is the list of features, list of user stories you want to do? Have business conditions changed? So suddenly somebody says, no, actually we don't need this, we need that. How does the current game look like? And how does the technology look like, right? Can the technology deliver whatever you might plan in features of building, or do you have to build a piece of technology first before you can do something else? So based on that, you engage in a sprint prioritization. You analyze and evaluate the product backlog, everything you thought about doing. You also look at the current game. And then based on that, you together select or define a sprint goal. What is it that we want to do in this sprint, right? What's the one change to the total playable game that we want to do in this sprint? And then based on that, you plan the sprint. Um, that is, you define, okay, what exactly does it mean we have to do to achieve this goal, um, to make the tutorial playable or something like that. That means you take the user stories from the backlog, the features from the backlog that you think bind together towards this goal. You have a look at them in terms of what tasks, concrete tasks by individual people that involves. That's your sprint backlog, the to-do list for that sprint. Um, and then you estimate how much hours each and every of these tasks take. And then you'll likely notice that again, not all of that fits into the sprint, so you have to prioritize there as well. But anyhow, that's your sprint backlog. So that's what you basically say. Okay, this is what we're going to do. Our to-do list for this sprint. So as I said, the team selects items from the product backlog they can commit to completing. So the idea in Scrum is not that you overpromise and then underdeliver or something like that. The idea is that you yourself honestly assess, given the time frame, given the amount of hours we as a team can put in this week, what is it realistically that we can achieve and that we then commit to? That's your goal, that's your tasks. You identify the tasks and estimate them in terms of how many hours they take. You do so together because everybody else can pitch in if there is an unclear understanding of what a task means, or somebody might estimate a task takes way longer than another person. Then you talk about why you estimate that. And you think about the total design of the game. So how this works, for instance, if you have a user story that you take from the backlog, something like, as a player, when I touch a ball that is touching at least one other ball of the same color, all matching balls are destroyed, right? Classic 3-tile matching game mechanic. You then ask yourself, okay, what do we have to do? We have to code the removing of the ball, the fact that the ball senses touch, the particle effect of disappearing. We have to test whether this works repeatedly, right? If other balls fall down, then again, the same work things. And we have to test the performance. And then you estimate how many hours it takes. So that's the sprint planning process. The second ceremony is the daily scrum. That is how you meet every day, and I can't stress this enough, in your team while you're on this project, in this class. You should somehow meet face-to-face or virtually face-to-face, I don't care how, but somehow face-to-face every day for this meeting. 15-minute maximum. If you can do it in meet space, meet in person, you should stand so that the meeting doesn't drag. This is not for problem solving, and usually you say everybody who wants to can come to this meeting, the client can come to this meeting, whatever, but only you, the team, can talk in this meeting. What do you do in this meeting? Basically, everybody just answers 3 questions. What did you do yesterday? Or will you do today? And is there anything in your way that the Scrum Master or the team can help you with doing this? That is what you every day commit to your team in terms of doing. Then the third regular ceremony is the sprint review. Sprint review basically means at the end of the sprint, right, you put everything together, you roll it into a playable piece of game, and then in that review you present out to the world what you accomplished during the sprint. You demo your features. It's very informal, so there's no formal presentation. You have to do this. You just have to show it off so people can interact with it, and give you feedback on what you're doing. And then as part of that sprint review, either at the end of it or in a separate meeting, you should also do a sprint retrospective. And maybe sometimes you say, no, let's only do this every second sprint or so. But the idea here is, if you think back about Kaizen, if you think about continuous improvement, that in Agile as well, you shouldn't just show off the product itself and look at what works in the product, but also the process and how you're working. So at the end of every sprint, typically 15 to 30 minutes, the whole team, Scrum Master, Product Owner, and team, maybe others if others are involved, stand together for 15-30 minutes, reflect on what worked, what didn't work so well in our process, how should we change our process. Right. One way, and we're going to have a whole session about sprint reviews, but one way of doing these sprint reviews is just asking 3 questions. What should we start doing? That is, what don't we do? What do we think is a good improvement? What should we stop doing? What is silly about our current process? And what should we continue doing? What really works well? Right? That's just one little template for how you do these things. Okay. Let's finally talk about the last components of this process, the artifacts, the objects you're interacting with. That's the product backlog consisting of user stories. That's the sprint backlog. And the sprint backlog you usually find on a Scrum board that involves a burn down chart. So let's talk about those in order. The product backlog, as you can see here, this is the product backlog, right? This is a list of all the desired work on the project. Everything, once you have an initial idea of how your game should look like, write your pitch, etc. Everything you roughly list out that would be great, that would make this game complete. Expressed in such a way that every item you list there is expressed as how it delivers value to the users or customers of the product as user stories. Sometimes you need to have technology that supports that. That's a tech story, but usually you should formulate it as something that has value to the user as user stories. Next slide, going to talk about what user stories are. This product backlog is then prioritized by the product owner, as we saw at the beginning of the project, right? In rough order of delivering value. And at every sprint you can reprioritize or you can add stuff to the project backlog. So how are things formulated in the project backlog? They were usually formulated in the form of user stories. And if you work analog, if you have a big board where you put up all these stories, you typically note that on a card, but most of the software that you have that supports this process, like Trello, usually these cards are digital. Anyhow, every card represents something that is called a user story. A user story is a little story that just explains what a certain type of user wants to do to achieve a certain goal or value. So the typical format of a user story, as you see down below here, user story. As a role, I want to solution so I can goal. So an example for this would be, if you look here, jumping, right? So this card has a title, so it describes what it does, and then it has a user story. As a player, I want to jump so I can escape enemies as part of your game. Then what do these user story cards usually also have? A ranking of importance. Sometimes you can just do that by rank the cards, so you don't give them any numbers. You just create lists. Sometimes you give them numbers. An estimate of how many hours it will take to do this. And then when you're working on the card, underneath that estimate, you estimate how much work on this is remaining. So you see two numbers have been struck out. So somebody worked on it, wrote down 4 hours remaining, struck it out, worked a bit more, 2 hours remaining, struck it out, 1 hour still remaining to get this to move. What else is then here? You see there are these little post-its here: implement jumping module, set parameters for level, playtest iterate parameters. These are basically the tasks in the sprint backlog that are connected to the story. Right? Sometimes in the analog world, these are actually stickies you put on top of this card. Again, in digital, you can do that differently. You see it says the task, it says who's going to do the task, and an estimated number of hours for that task. And then here you see the section how to demo. That is basically something that in Scrum is called a definition of done. One thing that people who've worked in Scrum or in Agile have noticed is that very often there is conflict and misunderstanding, and things don't get really done because people have an unclear understanding of what it means for somebody to actually do or finish or complete a task. So an important part of the Scrum framework is that you have a definition of done, of what it means to do something. So therefore, every of these user stories has its own little definition of done, which is how do I demo this feature is complete. So in this case, this is demoed by the character, figure is jumping. If somebody hits the space bar, jumping direction and speed interact with the cursor, so players can use the cursor buttons in order to control that. The character can jump over enemies on a platform, and the jump feels right to playtesters. Then jumping has been successfully implemented. A sample product backlog might then look something like this, right? You have a number of items ordered in rough priority, and every of these items has a rough estimate of how many hours this takes. Okay. And then, as I said, at the beginning of every sprint, the team gets together, looks at the product backlog, and says, okay, what is the one palpable change, improvement, addition to the game that we want to make? That's the sprint goal. It's a short statement of the work that you will try to accomplish in that sprint. So it could be something technical, like you say, we want to implement the database for storing achievements. Could be something that is reworking, refactoring, iterating. So you could say, this sprint is all going to be about game feel. We want to rework the main character movement to look and feel great. That's the sole focus of this one, because we think this is what helps the game most in the next iteration. Or implementing a new feature like final boss, players can try to beat the final boss. That's the focus of our iteration. These things, so the sprint goal and the user stories and the individual tasks, if you work in physical space, they're usually organized on something that's called a Scrum board, which is literally just a big board of stuff where everything is posted. So what you can see on this board here is you have columns that signal different kinds of statuses in which the different user stories or tasks are, and lanes. These lanes represent either user stories or teams. So you could imagine this lane here is all about something we want to do in this sprint, which is about getting deposit done. This here is about the user story of migration tool. This one is about the user story back office login. And then for each of these individual user stories, you have the different tasks here as post-its, little yellow post-its. And then as people work on these tasks, they move the post-its along the lanes, through the columns until they're done. This way, everybody in the team on one view can automatically see what the current status of work is. Right? You have a shared overview of what the status of work is. And these here are typical states of it. It's this is not checked out, or in preparation, or to be done. And then there's a middle one, which is checked out, or in progress, or I'm working on it. And then finally done, if it's actually done. And as you see here, there's a little definition of done, so that there's no misunderstanding when you can move a card from I'm working on it into done. Then what else can you see here? Items that popped up that are unplanned, that maybe wander into the next iteration. User stories you might think about doing next. The sprint goal, the overarching sprint goal, and a burn down chart where you can track your progress and your speed. As I said, the Scrum board is a very common way of organizing all this information about tasks, and you can do it digitally in Trello, because Trello has these nice different boards that you can basically use for the columns, and integrations that let you do burn down charts, etc. But you can do it digitally, you can do it physically. Another way of organizing the information, and there's lots of internet information about that if you want to read up on that, is a so-called Kanban board, which is also something you can use to organize all your work if you'd rather do that. Kanban board is something else that came out of Japanese project management, and it basically, the main thing that it does is for the different statuses that something can have. So it's chosen for to be worked on, selected, it's ongoing, it's done, it's deployed, it's live, etc. The main thing is that the Kanban board doesn't have a limit of how much stuff you commit to within an iteration, but it has a maximum number of items that can be in a given status. So you can say here, right, this is what the red numbers say. The red number says there can be a maximum of 3 things in development at one and the same time. This ensures that not too many things are started, people start to lose focus or overview over what they're doing, and that if something unexpected happens, like, right, the done starts to pile up here, lots of done cards, and somebody wants to move something from ongoing into done, but there are already 3 cards here, and the maximum here is 3, that then the whole team basically figures out what the reason for the bottleneck is, and everybody tries to work on the bottleneck so that you have a nice throughput, that you have a nice average time per card that goes through. Kanban board, also another nice way of organizing work. So, how do you manage the sprint backlog, the actual tasks that based on your user stories you then work on? The way Scrum works is, again, individuals sign up for work of their own choosing. It's not as if the team lead or a manager assigns work, individuals say, yeah, I'm willing to do this. The estimated work remaining is updated daily. That is on your little cards. Every day you note down, did so much work, I think this card still takes so and so long. Any team member can add to, delete, or change the backlog. You just have to inform your colleagues. And that way, as you're working on the sprint backlog, you have an idea of what work actually has to be done during the sprint. If anything, any specific task is unclear, or if anything pops up you don't really know yet, you define basically a card for it, and then you can break the card down later, or you sit together and said, hey, this task is too big, let's have a look at it, let's break it down. That's basically how you manage it. So just as a practical example, if you look at a sprint backlog, right, you have these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different cards. And at every day, people who work on the card note down how many hours are remaining. So you might work on coding the user interface on Monday, 8 hours are remaining. Tuesday, 4 hours are remaining. You feel you make real progress. But then on Wednesday, you notice, oh shoot, this involves much more work than I thought. Then you update the amount of work and it actually goes up again, right? Even though it got an hour. Whereas somebody who's coding the middle tier, you see slowly but steadily the amount of work still to be done whittles down. Write online help, assume to take 12 hours, and you say, okay, Tuesday, no work's remaining. That thing was done already in a day. So every day you work through and you note on every card how many hours are remaining. And this then, the remaining hours per day give you a good idea of how well you're working down the total amount of hours you estimated for the project. And that's basically your burn down chart. The idea about a burn down chart is you initially estimate how many hours your project will take in total, right? And then you throw everything out that doesn't fit into the total project time length. But then you take that, and every day on the sprint burn down chart, based on the actual hours that you manage to work down, on that burn down chart you note down, okay, from 1,000 hours we managed to reduce that. We managed to work 4 ideal hours down of that. So now it's not 1,000, now it's 996 hours that we still have to do. And then the nifty thing you can do about that is you can put an average line through that, and the average line helps you to see whether you are in time, so whether the average line reaches 0 when the total project ends, or whether you're too slow, right? Then the average line will end somewhere outside of the project end, or whether you're moving very fast, then the average line you move through will be before the actual project end. So that way you actually get to see, you actually have a statistic about how fast you're moving, and you get a statistic about whether your speed of working improves. So take an example, let's say at the beginning on Monday, all of this counts together as 20, 30, something like 45 hours. So on Monday, say 45 hours are remaining. Tuesday, you see, you count it all together and say, okay, that's roughly 30 hours, so you take down the 30 hours. Then Wednesday, you see problems with the interface pop up, so you add another hour. You see actually the board goes up. You say, are we going to make the Friday? This here looked good, right? This straight line suggested we were already gone on Thursday, but no, this gave problem. But then we see, okay, as time whittles down, we can see the speed of how we're moving. Okay, let's move through this. So this, in a nutshell, is the Scrum process. And at the end of this presentation, I gave you a total overview of how all of these different things work together as a little kind of cheat sheet for you. So you can print that out and ask me questions, because I know it's all in very tiny typeface. And if you have any questions, let me know in class. Thanks so much.